The ground is mushy. The ground is always mushy when we approach American dialects in general, and in particular, when we approach the details and the debates that surround the history of African American English. In this lecture, I would like to develop some of the remarks that I've been making throughout this course of lectures into a sustained engagement with what has come to be called African American English, or AAE. And what I'd like to do, in particular in this lecture, is call attention to some of the issues, some of them political, some of them social, some of them literary, and some of them imaginative. Issues that relate to the history of the African American peoples in America, and a way in which their history and their experience has had an impact on the American language, but more generally on English as a world language. It's important in this lecture, too, I think, to call attention to some myths about African American English, not simply to dispel them as myths, but to understand why they have become myths and why many Americans believe what they believe about the ways in which African Americans speak and write. Now, the history of languages of the Africans and of the African Americans is a very long one. The European contact with Africans was, in many ways, a linguistic one. That is, it was mediated by a variety of languages spoken in Africa, spoken in Europe, but also Arabic. For the Middle Eastern slave trade was originally an Arabic language slave trade long before it became a European trade. This relationship was also mediated linguistically by what are known as pidgins and creoles. What I would like to stress first is that there is no such thing as a single African language. There are many African languages and many different African language families. The differences between West African and East African, the differences between these languages and Southern African, all had an impact on the ways in which people of African ancestry came to the United States, or came to the colonies even before there was a United States. Speakers of these languages had an impact on the vocabulary, on the grammar, and on the sound of what was to become African American English. Now, one of the things that developed in the course of these earlier European periods of exploration, of colonialism, and of slave trading were what linguists call pidgins and creoles. I want to spend a little time with these kinds of languages, and I want to call attention to the ways in which they had an impact on the forms of African American speech and writing. Some pidgins and creoles were based on English, but others were based on other European languages of colonization or the slave trade. Some of them were based, for example, on Portuguese, some were based on French, and some were based on the older Arabic language of the slave trade. A pidgin, which we spell P-I-D-G-I-N, is a form of communication that enables two mutually unintelligible groups of speakers to communicate. Pidgins are often ad hoc forms of communication, and they are perceived as artificial by both groups of speakers. Now, by the way, the word pidgin comes from the 19th century Chinese mispronunciation of the English word business. Business, business, pigeon, pigeon. And so a pidgin, it is important to stress, is a form of communication which speakers recognize as artificial or as ad hoc. They were developed in trade and in commerce, and there is a sense that an individual speaker of a pidgin will not transmit or teach that form of communication to his or her children. Pigeons developed in trade and commerce, and they were the pigeons of the slave trade. They were the pigeons of the whaling industry. They were the pigeons of the opium trade and of the cotton trade, and so on. Now, Creoles are something different. A Creole is a language that develops over several generations as a distinctive language. Creoles often develop when the language of the colonizing or the economically dominant group is imposed upon a subordinate or colonized group. So Creoles may emerge from pigeons, but it is important to stress that the speakers of Creoles recognize them or think of them as languages. Creoles are taught by parents to children, and so there is a difference between a pigeon, which is an ad hoc form of communication among two mutually unintelligible speakers of language, and a Creole, which emerges as a self-conscious form of linguistic expression, which has a regional, a social, an ethnic, or a national identity. Now, as an aside, let me just offer a little provocation, a kind of extended parenthesis. Go back to my earlier lectures on Middle English. Is Middle English a pigeon or a Creole? See, what we saw in the history of the Norman conquest was the development of a form of speech between two mutually unintelligible groups, the Old English-speaking Anglo-Saxons on the one hand, and the Norman French-speaking Normans on the other. Gradually, what became what we call Middle English had elements of both. There were vocabulary elements, there were grammatical elements from the Romance languages, and there remained a kind of substratum of Old English. Is this hierarchization, if you like, of language something characteristic of a Creole? Can we say that it develops over time? Can we call Middle English something of the product of Creolization between Norman-speaking conquerors and Old English-speaking conquered? To get back to African American English, by understanding the origins of speech patterns of Africans and African Americans in historical ways, we can see that certain forms of African American speech have recognizable grammatical structures and recognizable patterns of syntax or word order. Let me stress the following. African American English is not a debased or simplified version of American English. In other words, people of African ancestry do not speak in a way that is wrong or that is simplified. By contrast, African American English is not a general black vernacular shared by all African Americans. Everyone of African American ancestry does not speak in the same way. Rather, we should consider African American English as a historically grounded linguistic phenomenon whose features may be shared by black and by white speakers of English in America. So some linguists have argued that African American speakers speak differently from each other because of regional variation, because of ancestry from certain parts of Africa, and also because of different cultural and social experiences. So let me try to call attention now to some recent work in African American English by contemporary linguists and scholars of the language. And our primary scholar, one of our primary scholars of African American English really for the past half century, is the linguist teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, William Labov. He prefers to call African American English Black English Vernacular. He considers Black English Vernacular to be a subsystem of English with a distinctive set of what he would call phonological and syntactical rules. In other words, there's an English language, a vernacular, spoken by individuals of African ancestry that in spite of regional, class, or social difference, may be seen as sharing certain kinds of pronunciation features and certain kinds of grammatical features. Now, many of these forms of pronunciation and of syntax and grammar do originate in Southern American dialects. So what we might call the Black English vernacular has certain features that it shares with Southern dialects, irrespective of the racial or the ethnic origin of the speakers. But there are also aspects of African American English, or of the Black English vernacular, that derive from the old slave Creoles of the Caribbean and of the Carolina coastline. One of the things that's very distinctive about African American English is that it has a highly developed verbal system, different from Standard English tense. This is what we call an aspect system rather than a tense system, and I'm going to talk about this in some detail. Let me, in order to do this, go to a specific Creole that might have had an impact on African American English, and this is known as Gullah. Gullah is a language that is a Creole-based language that is keyed to certain African American languages and is still spoken in some islands off of the coast of South Carolina. Some scholars have in fact argued that Gullah has had a great impact on African American English, and some have argued that Gullah, which is still spoken by about 250,000 people, may be very close to the original form of African American or Black English vernacular. Now, what are some aspects or features of Gullah? Let me give you some examples. Some people have argued that the pronunciation dem, which we could write out as D-E-M, is in fact not a problem of phonology, but a problem of grammar. In other words, dem is not a mispronunciation of them, but that it emerged in the Creole of Gullah as the demonstrative adjective and a signal of plurality. So that in Gullah, the phrase dem man is the plural form men, and that this is grammatical in the Gullah language. If we go back to Joel Chandler Harris and the passage that I read from the Uncle Remus stories in my previous lecture, we can see that some aspects of the language that Harris sought to represent may have certain features shared with Gullah. In particular, a feature of phonology, or of pronunciation, that is, the instability of the pronunciation of R. We saw that the loss of the final R in a word like sir, which Harris spells S-U-H, so to pronounce it as suh, that this contrasts with the intrusion of R in a word like master, which Harris spells as if it were pronounced marster. These spelling differences may be designed to evoke some of the ways in which the pronunciation of Gullah had an unstable R sound in certain phonological or pronunciation environments. And so what Harris is doing is he is using what we've called I dialect, certain forms of spelling, to indicate certain forms of pronunciation. Now, what we can see here, too, is that the verbal structures, as well as the pronunciation structures of African American English, may in many ways go back to these earlier Creoles, and they may also have certain regional forms. Now, I have been using the word aspect very generally. There's an aspect of a language. But aspect, when it is a technical term, means something very specific when linguists use it. That is, they use aspect to refer to a verbal structure. So let me clarify this point. In English, we use verbs to denote particular place in time. I go, I come, or I will go, or I came, or I have gone. These are ways of saying when an action happened. Now, English is a tense language. That is, it is a language which uses these different verbal forms to indicate when something happened. It is very difficult in a tense language to express duration in time. In other words, we do not have grammatical categories in English that make precise distinctions among the following categories: actions that began in the past and ended in the past, actions that began in the past and continue into the present and end in the present, actions that began in the past and continue into the present and may end sometime in the future, and actions that began in the past and may or may not end at any particular time, but that are indiscriminate actions. The things that I have described here are known technically as aspects, and there are some languages which have aspects. In other words, there are some languages which have specific grammatical categories to express these kinds of actions that I've just described. Ancient Greek, for example, has certain characteristic features of its grammatical system that are able to express this. Some non-Indo-European languages are based on aspect. The thing to recognize is that when an aspect language is at work, what it's interested in doing, or what it has the verbal resources to do, is express action in terms of its duration. So in African American English, or if you like, in Black English vernacular, what scholars have identified as expressions such as she sick, she go, she going, that these expressions offer us point in time. In other words, what matters is not whether the action is in the present or in the past, but that the action is not ongoing. In other words, something happened. By contrast, expressions such as she be sick, she be going, and so on, these express duration. In other words, the expression she be sick means that she got sick in the past and she continues to be sick. She be going to school means that at a certain point in the past, she started going to school and she's continuing going to school. Forms of the verb to be can signal special features of duration. This is, as many scholars recognize, one of the key grammatical features shared by the vernacular speech of many individuals of African ancestry, almost regardless of the geographical region from which they have come. In African American English, much like in earlier forms of Standard English, negation can be cumulative or it can be multiple. That is, this is another example of a grammatical feature of African American English. The idea of the double negative, for example, is not ungrammatical. So these are some grammatical features which seem to be shared by speakers of African ancestry of the Black English vernacular. Now, in terms of pronunciation, African American English is in many ways the language of a region as well as the language of individuals of African ancestry in America. And there are some aspects of pronunciation that I try to call attention to in my reading of the passage from Joel Chandler Harris. To be technical about it, what we could say is that the pronunciation of labiodental sounds is an issue. Now, labiodental sounds, you will remember from my initial lecture on articulatory phonetics, are sounds that are produced by combining the teeth and the lips. So, for example, a labiodental sound is a sound like an F or a TH. That is, you have sounds where the lips and the teeth come into play. So it seems to speakers of Standard American or non-African American speech, it seems that there is an apparent confusion in the pronunciation of the sounds of TH and F. So, for example, you see these forms of pronunciation where you have, instead of with, you have whiff, or you have them and dem, that these are not issues of the inability of individuals of African ancestry to pronounce certain sounds. This is not a question of anatomy. This is a question of the inventory of sounds. That is, that African American English, or the Black English vernacular, may be said to have a different phonemic inventory than Standard English. And just as speakers of non-English languages have difficulty recognizing distinctions in sound, so similar, because their language has a different set of meaningful sounds. So speakers of African American English tend to produce a different set of sounds than speakers of Standard English. Now, there are certain parts of speech which seem to be omitted in African American English. And a question may be, are these issues of pronunciation or are these issues of grammar? Let me give you an example. She jump over the table, or a phrase, brown-eyed beauty. Now, is this an instance in which you have certain sounds in the language elided in certain phonemic environments? In other words, she jumps over the table. Is this a matter of pronunciation, or is it a matter of grammar? Some have argued that the difference between she jumps and she jump is not a grammatical one, but one of pronunciation. In other words, the issue here is that in certain phonemic environments, an S is elided. Similarly, the difference between saying a brown-eyed beauty and brown-eye beauty, is this a matter of pronunciation, or is it a matter of grammar? This is a central debate. Now look, to this point I've been talking about African American English and the Black vernacular as if it had simply one register. But African American English has had and continues to have, throughout its history, many discourses. African Americans have been literate and literary writers since the 18th century. Some of the earliest and most profoundly moving documents of American literature are the slave narratives, the stories that the slaves dictated, or at times even wrote themselves, of their captivity and their release. These are some of the earliest documents in American literature. Poets and songwriters preserved many features of the language of African Americans in the 19th century. Frederick Douglass, as we have seen, illustrated the ways in which the language of the Bible and of the elevated political discourse inflected the languages and the forms of speech of African Americans. The range of African American literary expression is so vast that I, of course, cannot cover it here in a single lecture. But I think what we can do is identify a few features of the discourses that had an impact on our own English. So let's look at some issues of vocabulary, of register, of imagination, and of grammar to get a sense of how African American speech had an impact on English. A good place to begin is, of course, vocabulary. And there are old words from the world of the slaves that are perhaps evidence of African or Creole languages. A word like goober for the peanut, a word like jazz for a form of music, the verb tote, meaning to carry, foods like gumbo and okra, are obviously from an African-inflected culture and African languages that the slaves brought with them as they brought the seeds of okra and the gumbo to the Americas. Banjo is a musical instrument, yam, a kind of food. These are the terms of food and the terms of performance activity, which go back to words of African origin. Take an expression like badmouth as a verb. This may be a translation of an African language expression, de ngeme, from the Vai language of Africa. Other expressions, such as the universal negation may be based on older African or Creole expressions. And so too may be the expression look-see, as in the form of take a look-see. This may be modeled on an African language. Popular music and media have also given many words and phrases to modern American English. And perhaps more important than cataloging such locutions is to stress the impact of African American speech forms on the phrasal shape and the rhythm of everyday speech. For example, we could note especially the impact of African American spiritual devotion on the language of religion in America, and the way in which the elevated language of the scriptures textured the performative voice of African American oratory. African American oratory traces its origins back to the great pulpit preachers of the 19th century. And we can, if you like, see this strain together with the language of the slave and the language of popular culture. And so one could argue that there is as much of Homer as hip-hop. There is as much high culture as popular culture in African American speech. Let's look historically at this. When you think about African American popular speech and popular culture, you may think of hip-hop, or you may think of earlier, you may think of jive, you may think of scat, you may think of the hepster of Cab Calloway of the 1930s. You may think about the scat songs of Ella Fitzgerald of the 1950s and 60s. What happens when you think of a contemporary rapper like Tupac Shakur, who talks about being ready for the funk? And when he says in a passage that I think I can quote from him, quote, "But I don't think they knowin', straight to the depths of hell is where those cowards goin'." Straight to the depths of hell. This is a line that evokes to me the image of Frederick Douglass's runaway slave. It is a phantasmagoria as much as the fantastic phantoms that flit through the mind of Douglass's slave. It is a line that, if I had read it to you without attribution, straight to the depths of hell, seems unmarked by race or by experience. But when Tupac says, "is where those cowards goin'," that grammatically changes it. What it does is it shows us that when the words of white experience are put in black mouths, we see what the scholar Henry Louis Gates has called signifying, the way in which simply parroting or ventriloquizing the language of the master in the mouth of the slave, the language of the dominant in the mouth of the subordinated, white language in black mouths, these are the ways of radically changing and challenging meaning and inheritance. And so, when we look not simply at popular culture, but when we look at pulpit oratory, we see forms of signifying at work. In Ralph Ellison's brilliant novel, Invisible Man, we see early in the novel the figure of Homer Barbee, the great blind pulpit orator. No accident that his first name is Homer. And so he speaks in the Southern College Chapel, and I quote, "This barren land after emancipation, this land of darkness and sorrow, of ignorance and degradation, when the hand of brother had been turned against brother, father against son, and son against father, where master had turned against slave, and slave against master, where all was strife and darkness and aching land, straight to the depths of hell." This is the language of the Bible, and it is the language of exile, of Old Testament verbiage transformed into the slave and post-slave experience. We were slaves in Egypt. We were slaves in America. That shared sense of enchainment and of liberation gave to the 19th and 20th century African American an almost allegorical sense of his or herself in a larger biblical narrative. And so, when Ellison's Homer Barbee concludes by saying, "Let my people go," what you hear is the language of Moses in the mouth of an African American. Perhaps the greatest single African American to take the language of Moses and transform it into the experience of liberation was, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. And in his great "I Have a Dream" speech delivered in the March on Washington in 1963, King brings together all the images and idioms of African American experience and speech that I have been discussing in this lecture. "I have a dream," King begins, and he repeats that phrase over and over and over again, that one day every valley shall be exalted. This repetition of "I have a dream" drives home like a hammer driving nails into the experience of the desire for freedom. Every valley shall be exalted, as if the language of the Bible filtered through the oratory of Handel has now been transformed into the speech of the black man. This is signifying, and one of the great moments of signifying in this speech, it seems to me, is that great moment when King gives voice to something that I, as a child, had heard over and over again. For when I was a child in school, we used to sing, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. Of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside." And when King said these words, I, 8 years old, watching him on television, could never hear that hymn again in quite the same way. This is the signifying. This is the moment of the language of white America, the language of the Bible, the language of prayer coming into the experience of slavery. King juxtaposes that language with a heightened vocabulary, and in his I Have a Dream speech, we hear words like prodigious, expressions such as snow-capped, and phrases like curvaceous ring throughout. And as we think of this great speech, we can see, once again, the syntheses at work. Free at last, he says. The language of the African American synthesizes with the language of white culture, of biblical culture. The slave and the Bible come together in so many ways. The language of African American English, of the Black English vernacular, is a history of the syntheses that I have been discussing here. And in the course of this lecture, I've tried to call attention to just some of these. Of course, I cannot touch on all of them, but what I want each of you to recognize is the way in which the African American experience has changed irrevocably the speech, the writing, and the imaginative structure of English in America and throughout the world. And what I want you to hear along with me is the way in which such old familiar words like freedom can never sound or mean the same again.